We're going to our workshop by Rinke Hendriksen and to discuss how to develop your tokenomics, so your incentive model within your application. Rinke, as well, can introduce himself even more, of course. He has worked on the incentives model of Swarm and is currently one of the researchers at the Swarm project. Rinke, are you live?
I believe I am. Would you tell me?
You're coming through loud and clear. Yeah.
All right. Yeah, then I'm live.
If you have any questions during the talk, please raise your hand and you'll be given the word to ask your question or to discuss with Rinke the ideas about your project or the questions you may have about the presentation. Okay. Take it away.
Yeah, so, well, thanks a lot for the introduction, Robert, and thank you also for the opportunity to present here. First things off, I don't think I'm going to talk a lot about token economics specifically. And that's because I made my presentation with this particular title, thinking I would venture into token economics, but actually while creating it, I realized that I didn't. So my presentation has opened quite a lot of space for interaction. So perhaps, you know, together with everybody who is listening, we will eventually end up into token economics. That's good for me. But just so you know, I would like to talk about creating a viable project on top of Swarm and basically what it means to have a viable project. All right, so yeah, a bit about me. Robert already introduced me partly. So I've been working with the Swarm project now for almost 2 years, I think. I've been active as a product owner of the B project, and yeah, this is the first announcement, I think, but I will be starting up a research track with Swarm. So I'm really excited to go and start that, and yeah, really think about all kind of things that are possible with Swarm and that are needed to do research on. But apart from that, perhaps relevant for this talk, I do have a background in economics. I studied a bachelor in economics and business economics here in Rotterdam. And yeah, so from that angle, I also have some interest in business and also token economics as we can do on the blockchain. So that's about me. Here is what I want to talk about today. So when I was thinking about, okay, so what is a viable project on top of Swarm, I naturally was venturing into like e-business, right? Because basically what we're doing here is a continuation of that. So I'll present you with a bit of history of the e-business, also to give you a perspective on yeah, why and how we ended up where we are right now. Then I'll highlight where Swarm differs from normal web. It will also make the bridge to what this means basically for your business or your project on top of Swarm. And then I'll dive into the main questions of yeah, creating a viable project on top of Swarm. And that's it. So let's get started with a brief outline on the history of e-business. And yeah, so in the 1980s, a little bit early even, but around that time, basically the internet actually really started to emerge. This is the first decade where personal computers were being sold. And by the way, I might not be completely historically accurate, right? There might be people listening here say, oh no, maybe personal computer actually was earlier than that time or later, but it's I hope it's at least roughly accurate and that it supports the narrative which I want to bring here, which is that, you know, first we had the personal computer and the internet, and they were being developed mostly by universities, also by the military, but it was really for exchange of information. You saw projects where people were getting in touch with each other. They were exchanging information. There were projects to start encyclopedias on the internet, and it was really this space where there were a lot of people. And when I read about that time, I think it's in many ways it's a reminiscence to what we see right now in the cryptocurrency industry, namely that there is a lot of people with a very big vision on the internet and how it would change our worlds, basically. So we head into the 1990s, where basically the first entrepreneurs started to tinker with, okay, so if we have these personal computers and people own them, what would it mean for business? So can I maybe sell my products via the internet to people? And it turned out they could. So in the 1990s, there were the very first internet marketplaces, and there were also a lot of investment capital coming into the internet. And again, here you can see a parallel to what is happening right now in the blockchain industry. But that's not the point of my talk. Anyways, it's funny to see. So there was a lot of interest in people really believing in this power of the internet and really believing it would change the world, and also believing that if they would invest money in the internet, that this money would return. And it did for a while, until in the 2000s, early the dot-com bubble burst. And why did it burst? Well, that was because so much investment had gone into this internet business, whereas actually most of the internet companies didn't have the revenue streams to support all of those investments. And yeah, this was realized, of course, sooner than later. So all these internet companies, which started in the 1990s, many of them actually got bankrupt, and a few of them survived. And these are still the very big internet platforms which we know nowadays. But of course, the investors after the dot-com bubble, they got a bit frightened, and they were like, okay, so now we really need to figure out a business model, because it's just needed, because we made a lot of loss on our other investments, and we really don't want those companies which are still standing. We really don't want them to fail. So there was a very big pressure from investors to come up with that the companies would have a viable business model. And I believe that also in that time, really the game of online advertisement got big. It got so big because companies and big internet platforms, they actually realized that by knowing a lot about their clients, they could have very targeted advertisements, which then would make their clients to spend more on their platform. And so basically the narrative of the dominant business model on the internet being advertisements was born. And up until now, I think this whole narrative, it got really big. So advertisements is really what drives the growth of the internet, the growth of many of the big companies on the internet right now. Even the data, which basically is underlying the possibility to do these very targeted advertisements, is being quoted as the new gold. But what I would like to bring home here to you is that advertisement as an e-business model is really not the only option. So this was an option which the group of entrepreneurs and the group of investors basically focused upon after the burst of the dot-com bubble. And it's being seen, I think, right now really as kind of the only way of doing business on the internet and making money on the internet. Maybe not the only way, but it's really the most dominant way. And it's usually what new entrepreneurs, when they think about starting a business on the internet, what they think about. Either, they just want to do advertisements directly themselves, or they just want to grow so big so that they can be adopted by one of these other big internet molochs, and they have the profit that way by basically selling the company and selling the data that the company is gathering. But it's not the only option. I just want you to remember that. However, we of course have to be creative, because if we cannot follow what most of the people are doing, if we want to do something else, it really requires a strength of character, and it also requires creativity to come up with what then. And me also, I don't have the right, all the answers here. So that's why we're here together on the summer school to learn from each other. And the reason why Swarm is interesting in this context is basically that Swarm forces us to rethink. And the reason why that is the case has to do with basically how Swarm is being built up from the ground up in a fundamentally different way than how the internet as we know nowadays is being built. And I think this naturally goes into my second topic of my talk, which is where Swarm differs from the normal web. And I hope that you have seen it, but in the announcement for my talk, I asked everybody to watch the video, which was recorded at EFCC about a month ago in Paris. And here I explain what Swarm is. And I think if you consider to start a business, or if you have a great idea and you want to use Swarm, really the first thing that you should think about is, okay, so what is this thing that I'm having here? So it's important to dive into that yourself, even if you're not so technical, because Swarm is many things. And Swarm is different than the standard architecture that we're having nowadays. So I have my own ideas about what I believe Swarm is best at, or what I believe would be great to use Swarm for. But above all, I think that Swarm, it is a possibility to do things differently. We need to do things differently, but it's also a possibility. And because of that, even from within the Swarm team, we might not have the ultimate knowledge of where Swarm is going to be placed best. And to get that ultimate knowledge, I do believe it's important that you know what Swarm is, what kind of stack you're dealing with. And if you have ideas about how you would use this stack, please reach out to us and please let's have this, this conversation about it. Okay, so recommended talk if you didn't watch it. Anyways, I will briefly touch upon what is important for this conversation. And that is like to highlight where Swarm differs from the normal web. So this is a very, very, very basic representation of how internet pages are being served to you nowadays. And it's what we call the client server architecture. So the client is, here it is a laptop, or it is a mobile phone, or it is anything that the consumer or that a person controls. And when I'm requesting, let's say, a Wikipedia page, basically what my device is doing is sending a message to a server. And this server is being owned by the Wikimedia Foundation in this example. And it understands what I'm requesting, and it sends back the response via this, this internet protocol, and it sends it to the client so that my browser can display, the page about bunnies to me. Maybe I'm interested in that. So this is basically how web pages are being served nowadays. And we had the example of Wikipedia, but I think it's important to realize that whenever we have any platform built on top of this architecture, that the server is always controlled by one entity. And this is usually a for-profit corporation. Well, not in the case of Wikipedia, but I think this is, it's just one odd anomaly here, because most of the time these are for-profit companies that are owning this server and that want to do something with that power that they have. right? So the servers, they have a lot of information. They not only store the data that is being served in the response, but they also store a lot of data about the clients, who is accessing what. And yeah, this is basically the power that these servers have. And with this model that is underlying the web, my argument is that basically anybody who wants to start something on top of the web doesn't have another possibility but to have this power to, they need to control the server. So the power will ultimately be theirs, whether they want it or not, and whether the client wants it or not. That's just inherent to the architecture of the web nowadays. Okay, Swarm is fundamentally different, as I mentioned, but also not too different, right? So it's just one picture different, and that's because Swarm can also be depicted as virtual server. So here we have a real server, and here we have a virtual server. And what does it mean, virtual? Well, it basically means that it emulates the functionality of a real server, but that it is not a real server, right? So it's a network of computers who collaborate together and who jointly can answer a request from the client with a response, right? That's what Swarm does. That's one way of visualizing Swarm. And that's the way I would like to look at Swarm for the sake of this presentation, because this difference actually has a lot of consequences. First of all, the content is not anymore owned by one server. So what I mean with that is that previously in the client-server architecture, the server always had to store the content themselves in order to give a request. But with Swarm, with this virtual server, the content is not anymore owned by one server. What's more, I would argue that the definition of ownership of content, as we know nowadays, is not even applicable to Swarm, right? Swarm has this funny way of ownership where whenever you upload something to the Swarm network, it's not really yours anymore. And it's also not really owned by the net. It's maybe owned by the network, but the network is not owned by anybody. The network is this collaboration of computers who all independently collaborate, and it's decentralized. So there's not really one entity I can point to as this entity is owning the network. So because of that, whenever you upload some content to the network, it's not anymore owned by the server, but it's also not really owned by the uploader. So that's interesting. And from that, there are consequences actually from that, because in the client-server architecture, whenever, let's say Facebook wants to do an update and the users don't agree with that particular update, the users don't have a choice but to accept that platform, yes or no. Or if Facebook is showing advertisements to the users and the users don't want that, don't want those advertisements because they don't like them, well, they either have to take it or leave it, literally, in the case of Facebook. But on Swarm, whenever content is uploaded to the network, this content is in the public. And Swarm, in that sense, is immutable because the content on sich won't change anymore. But of course, we can still do updates in Swarm, which is by kind of referencing the old version and then creating a new one. But it's not that one entity exclusively can do such updates, right? It's really that anybody who wants to make a copy of one instance and basically create a new one, so fork the running instance of this application, can do so. And that's also because the content is not anymore owned by one server. Also, the development of that content, development of the platform, can also not, it's not only up to one entity to decide that. And I think that's really powerful, and it's a super powerful concept that is inherently inside Swarm, which you understand if you truly understand how Swarm is different than the normal web. Another very interesting thing is that the application provider does not anymore need to maintain a server, right? So in the client server architecture, whenever I wanted to host a website, I need to run my own server to host that website. Or nowadays in the Web 2, I would task Amazon to host my server, but then I will have advertisement and I will subject all my users to the analytics of Amazon, which I might not want to do. But if I host my application on top of Swarm, I don't anymore need to maintain a server. And what is most important is that whenever my application becomes popular, if I were to host my own server and I suddenly have millions of users of my server might crash, right? Unless you have Amazon. But if I host my application on top of Swarm and my application suddenly becomes very popular on top of Swarm, actually I'm in a very fortunate position, because that means that the users of my application will pay for its persistence. And I don't anymore need to pay for the process stamp myself, because the application will stay afloat in the network, because the chunks that make up this application are very popular, right? So also from this point, I believe it has far-reaching consequences, but more on that later. And then the third point, which kind of, is a conclusion from the first 2 points, which is that the developers have much more freedom whenever they develop an application on top of Swarm. I think it's much easier to bootstrap something on Swarm. It's also much easier to go through the growth phase of Swarm, because this infrastructure is provided by Swarm. And also because, and this may seem a bit counterintuitive, because if you don't anymore really own the platform yourself, that also means that the platform can start taking a run on its own, which in the kind of normal way of thinking may not sound very good. But if your goal is not to create a platform and have as much power over it yourself as you want, which I hope is not your goal, but if you want to have a platform which has maximum impact, that is actually a very good thing if people can fork the running instance of your application and just go and build really something that has the most impact, and not necessarily something that is controlled by you. Yeah. Okay, so all very nice and well. You may question, okay, so but what does this mean for my project? How do I make a viable project on top of Swarm? And here, when I was preparing this talk for myself, I actually found that I fell into a trap. And I'm curious if you guys will fall into the same trap. No worries if you don't, but I would like to know, maybe 3 people can tell me what they believe is a viable project. And Gaspar, I know that you can give the mic to people. I don't have Zoom in front of me, but if you can do that.
So please raise your hand if you dare to answer the question.
Yeah, maybe you first, Robert. In your opinion, what does it mean to have a viable project?
Viable. In the sense of, well, I would say self-sustainable, meaning that in the future there would still be it would still be maintained, so that it's let's say if I want to invest my time in using the application, I want to make sure that I can continue to use it as long as I need the use, the premise of the application. So it's also why companies sometimes choose for a risk-averse solution with support. And that could be one of the arguments to call something viable, I would say.
Okay. Okay. So self-sustainability and the assurance that whenever you invest time in it now, it will still be around in some time.
Especially if the application will be part of my stack, of which other parts will depend, and how the sustainability is done by altruism of developers or by a payment model wouldn't matter as much to me. But I want to make sure that for the future I'm still able to use it.
Okay. Okay. Interesting. So maybe somebody else can also answer.
I see Petra.
So I think maybe to minimize down to four requirements for viability of a project. I think that it's got to have the ability to set some expectations in the user about the use case, and it has to fulfill those expectations. If it doesn't do that consistently across the process, then obviously it's not going to be adopted. I think it needs to be discoverable to users, because if they can't find it, they're not going to use it. And it needs to be accessible to those users when they try and discover it, because if they try and utilize the use case and for some reason there's a failure in the process itself, then they won't return afterwards to try and use it again. But with those four, I think you get everything.
Right. So what you're saying, you're really more thinking about your users, and you believe that the project is viable when, you know, basically the expectations of your users are fulfilled, when your users can find your project and, you know, when they can use it, right? You believe that's a viable project. Yeah. Yeah. Well, I agree. That's a very useful narrative. Okay. Maybe one more person.
In the meantime, I'd like to point out, by the way, that the tokenomics talk you mentioned earlier on ETHCC can be found by the link which Casper shared in the chat. If someone else wants to view it later on. We'll also share it in the Discord channel.
It's not a talk on token economics, by the way. It's a talk on, you know, what is Swarm.
Fair enough. You touched upon it a bit. So if anyone else would dare. In the meantime, I have another question, by the way, also from one of the participants, if you'll take. The question is Swarm adult friendly? In other words, could we build an adult app on Swarm?
Well, who would stop you?
No one outside. Oh, okay.
Yeah, I mean, like, you can do. There's not really. In Swarm, you can upload anything you want, yeah, so I think you can do that. Yeah. Okay, so I will go to my presentation again to continue the narrative. And maybe I owe you an explanation, because I said that I fell myself in a trap here, and I fell myself in a trap because I was thinking about the business model, and that is also why explicitly I first had the title of my talk, how do I create a viable business model on top of Swarm? And that's when I started to think about the business model, and I just noted for myself that whenever I started to think into business model, basically my mind went into this box. And I think this is just for yourself important to realize. It's the power of language and the power of concepts, that whenever we talk about a business model, at least when I do talk about the business model, I immediately think about revenue, about users, about VC funding, about all this kind of stuff, which I feel may not necessarily what we need for a viable project. So that is the trap I fell into myself. And I just want to tell you, you know, like with Swarm being something completely new, if we really want to find the killer use cases on top of Swarm, I believe we need to think outside of the box. And that's why the use of concepts such as business model, at least for me, it provides, it is limiting. So maybe interesting for yourself to just pay attention to. So I wanted to share that because yeah, this is what I wrote down, you know, a viable project. Okay, so I create a company which will have a certain expected revenue so that I can maintain myself, my company, right? So that's a perfectly valid business model. I'm not, you know, saying it's bad, but thinking this way, I feel it's thinking inside the box, and you probably will have quite hard time trying to apply, you know, like a common way of doing business on the client server architecture on top of Swarm. And that's because in Swarm, you know, you as the entrepreneur won't be the owner of the platform on sich. So you'll give up a lot of power that you have if you're normally owning a server. And because of this, it may be difficult. I'm not saying it's impossible, but it may be difficult to come up with ideas that satisfy one. Secondly, it's actually what has been done very commonly. It's so I create a company and I apply for VC funding. So that's venture capital funding or angel funding. So people who are wanting to invest money in your company, and it doesn't matter whether you have a revenue stream or an expected revenue stream in the future. Yes, no, all that matters is your narrative to the investors. And if your narrative is good enough, and if you can convince your investors that in the future you will be profitable, you will get VC funding. And then from that point onwards, the people who invest in you will try to get more people to invest in that as well, so they can exit, and there will be another round and another round and another round. And that's basically how it can happen. That's really big companies, like for example, Twitter. I'm not even sure if Twitter is profitable nowadays, but it wasn't profitable, I think 2 years ago. So this is based on this idea that you know, we invest in the platform, this platform becomes big, and many people believe that eventually it will become profitable, and that's how basically a platform can stay afloat and can grow very big without even a revenue inside, right? So that's a second model, and also this second model, so basically both models are sustained with the advertisement way of doing things. So in the first thing, when you sell advertisements, you can have real revenues. And the second one, you don't need to have real revenues. You only need to convince your VCs that you have a very big user base, and you will be able to do analytics on your user base or sell it to other companies. And with that narrative, many companies actually get VC funding. And they might even eventually be sold to Google, right, as an exit. So these are kind of the two ways, and use those ways, first of all, when I started to think about the viable business model on top of Swarm. And I was also thinking about the first one. And the first one, I think, is also pretty common. And I just have this idea about the social entrepreneur. So it's really something. I think even Mark Zuckerberg, right? He set up a platform doing a lot of good for humanity, right? He just wanted to have a Facebook where his classmates from the university could sign into, and they could share birthdays and all that, you know, great things. And but you know, he needed to pay for his operation costs. And I don't know if this is really how it happened with Mark Zuckerberg, right? But it can be that somebody who has this very human idea about doing something good for the world, setting up an internet business, but eventually, because this person is owning a server, and the server, you know, need to have a very big infrastructure because your platform is extremely successful, you need to think about a way to cover the operation costs. And also investors will hear and see about your big platform, and they will get on board. And with investors on board, it may be that gradually the original intent of the platform is lost. And it's because most of the investors, and definitely not all of them, but many investors, when they invest in your company, the thing that they are actually interested in the end is return on their money. And return on the money, you know, it just means that we need to think about the standard business model. And again, comes in this power of language. So if you have a business model, you need to do things in a certain way, and then let's do things that was successful in the past, and maybe we should sell advertisements to cover up for our costs or something like that, right? So I believe this also happens quite a lot. So, you know, these are kind of original ideas about the viable project. But I do believe that Swarm basically breaks this conundrum. And that's because it relieves startups from maintaining the infrastructure. And yeah, so they, you know, they don't have to maintain the infrastructure. And I think this is double. Yeah, okay. So, you know, startups basically don't have to maintain the infrastructure anymore. So that means that as a startup, it's much easier to just focus on the impact that you want to have. And you don't need to worry about a lot of server costs, which are going to come when your project becomes successful, because that's where Swarm takes care of. And yeah, I just want to stress that viability does not necessarily mean having a business model or having like a traditional business model, but of course your project needs to be viable. But I'm going to advocate actually against a business model because I think that having a business model implies kind of thinking in the old way, at least for me. And I feel that this thinking in the old way, it brought us where we are. And I think as humanity nowadays, we do have a lot of problems. But luckily, we also have an abundance of resources, and we have really this global communication literally at our fingertips, right, at our keyboard. And I think that these world's biggest problems can be solved, and we are not that far away, basically. And, you know, having a business model also means having a beneficiary, right? If you have a business model, you have revenue streams, or you have an owner, and this owner will be the beneficiary of all of that. And I feel that doing it in this way, it also stifles the possibility for collaboration, because think about, you know, your friend starts a business and he's earning maybe 3,000 euros a month with that particular business. And now we ask to you, okay, so maybe could you please help me? And do you want to help him for free if you know that he's the beneficiary of this company? I probably wouldn't. I probably would at least ask a share of that, right? So it's really a barrier for collaboration. And now think about this friend who is really excited about what he's doing, about the impact he's going to have for his world, but he does not necessarily have a revenue stream, and he's also not positioned in this way where he will be the ultimate beneficiary whenever this platform is becoming successful. And then this person asks, hey, Rinke, you have skills, and I think that you can help me with that. Do you want to help me? And I will probably say, okay, sure. I mean, I have an hour every evening that I want to spend on projects, which I love, and I think I would be very happy to help you on your cause. So that's just something to think about. And it's also something, you know, for yourself, because I feel that nowadays in the world, and we are always trying to push startups into this direction of having a business model, right? In every boot camp, in everything, you will have to think about this. And I just want to let you know that maybe we shouldn't, right? And also to strengthen you in your belief that maybe you don't want to think about this right now because you just want to have impact. And in order to have impact, I don't think you necessarily need a business model. So, but you of course need to be viable. And that's why I'm going to define viability in my way. And I think that viability, it just means that you as a person need to have the energies to start, to continue, and have impact, right? If this energy is there, and if you can somehow maintain this energy, maybe people will tag along and the energy will become bigger. And yeah, I think that for me means viability. Yeah, that's also the end of my talk. So I would like to end with asking you what makes your project viable, and that's it.
Thank you, Rinke. I think that's a good question to ask. this is also a moment actually to pitch that. So anyone would like to share how their efforts have been, or how your project be different in the sense that does your project already have a business model, or does it relinquish one in the sense that Rinke just described? Please let us know, and feel free to raise your hand. Because we noticed with the rise of decentralized projects and the incentives around it, that there is a lot of options, room to find alternative forms of compensation, or even non-compensation. By the way, how did you, Rinke, get to the conclusion that there wouldn't, let's say, never would need to be a business model inside? How did it require? What were the prerequisites for you to get there?
Okay. Well, don't get me wrong. I'm not necessarily against having a business model, but yeah, as I explained, whenever I was making my presentation, and the presentation was based on a discussion with you, we were thinking about startups, and let's try and help them making a business model, and that's basically how I started to make my presentation. And I just noticed for myself how limiting it is to think about the business model. And I have seen firsthand, even Swarm, right? So Swarm doesn't have a business model in the traditional sense, right? We do have ideas about how we want to stay viable in the future. But if you think about the traditional business model, it's not a model that applies to Swarm, and Swarm is already existing for 7 years. And for 7 years, we managed to create the energy and to get the energy going somehow. And I feel that in the blockchain industry, I see many people who get a lot of energy from an idealistic perspective. So they have the personal energy because they believe in what it means for themselves and for their project. And they can tag along many people with that energy. And we have open source, basically. You can contribute open source. And I think that, if you don't have to maintain a server, it is possible not necessarily always to think about money, because if you deploy something on Swarm, you don't need a lot of money to maintain your infrastructure. So you can just keep that out of the equation for a while. And I think that there will always be a possibility to maintain yourself as well, because let's be real, anybody will need to do the groceries. But I think that if you're working on a project that is having a lot of impact, you'll find people who will want to sustain you in your endeavor. I don't think that will be a problem. Yeah, if you have problems with that, just speak up, and you'll probably find somebody to help you.
Maybe Petra does. I see your hand raised. Petra?
So I think for me, I'm coming from the perspective of being part of an institution, almost a business that's been viable for over a decade. There are so many people involved in the community that, in fact, we had a major disruption this year, along with COVIDs and all the lockdowns and everything that's been going on politically here in the United States over the last year and a half. Our CTO and CEO, the same person, who has been standing in the way of blockchain development on our platform for several years now, finally stepped down and left a huge vacuum. But the community rushed forward to take up the parts that they were responsible for, and we've been struggling, but in a very short turnaround of a couple of months, managed to get the business up and running again, completely migrated our entire website, did a whole bunch of things in the last several weeks, really intensely, but with a huge amount of community input, because the will was present to keep us moving along. I sort of because we were meeting those expectations, because they were so well defined, because people were constantly like seeing us in their life, they were drawn in to make those impacts happen. I guess from the startup perspective, trying to get the ball rolling, you really have to reach that moment where you've exceeded the competition that's inherent in the market. On the other side, I'm trying to develop this project with NFTs and content and licensing and distribution, which is the business model that I'm coming from in entertainment. And what I've discovered is that there's an enormous amount of individuals in the markets, in entertainment, in games, in a lot of these places in IT, who have been told that blockchain is a failure, that it is enormously consumptive of resources. There's all kinds of myths that persist in the commercial space about blockchain projects that say, oh, it's just evil, it's just wrong. But on the other side, I'm actually inside of a lot of economic groups and industry groups where I know the people who are speaking, and I can see who they're connected to, and I know what projects are nascent in the economy and in the markets. And I know that there are a large number of individuals working at large corporations who are perpetuating these myths to the customer base on the outside, but at the same time are working together with the people at their corporation to develop these projects. So what that says to me is that the amount of competition at this point in the evolution of smart contract technology, especially distributed web, Web3, is immensely competition driven, right? We're still somewhat dependent on AWS to some degree in order to launch a lot of these projects. DAOs exist and are proliferating, but the core infrastructure that they're utilizing outside of a couple of smart contracts and bonding pools in limited reaches of the Ethereum space or in other side chains or other blockchains, is like Discord or other centralized services, which obviously result in the solution that the large corporations have total visibility to the conversations and the development that's ongoing. They extract whatever insights or developments are available for them to get out of those processes. They take them back into their closed factory silos where they develop faster with more resources and more advertising and more revenue because they've already got the VC and they've already got the viable business come. So my question is sort of like, how do we overcome that sort of loop where new ideas and innovations are going to be captured by more competitive, larger organizations that have the level of organization to be able to control their resources against the sort of freeholders in the open source development space who may or may not have the level of integration amongst themselves, or organization amongst themselves to be able to form a real opposition to those forces. I guess that's my question.
Well, it's a lot to unpack there.
Sorry.
So yeah, no worries. So I think first of all, like in this whole decentralized ecosystem, and let's call it the blockchain ecosystem, right? Like I can't sworn to that, even though we are not really building a blockchain. But I feel that all we are doing right now, there are many projects active in this space, and they are independent projects. But what I personally feel, whenever I go and meet people, I think that we all have the same goal, and that's basically to create a space where people can interact with themselves, being humans, which is not necessarily tied to the power structures which are inherent in the current world. And I feel that those power structures, in a very large way, are also based on money and on many of those things, which basically keeps those power structures in place nowadays. And yeah, we aren't there yet, right? So if, let's say, the big epic battle would start tomorrow, you're right in saying that, people currently in power, they are better organized. I mean, not better, but they're very well organized. They have a lot of power. They have a lot of financial resources. But I think if you look at the blockchain ecosystem, we have a really strong vision, and there's such a rapid development ongoing. And I think that Swarm having this decentralized data storage is a very critical piece in this. In this development. So, to come back directly to your question, which is what was it again? But I think you asked, okay, so what can we do against that? I think we're doing everything right now with developing Swarm and with developing so many other projects that are building towards that mission. We are just not yet there, but we are coming there gradually. And if you believe in that mission, you can build your project on top of this infrastructure. And by doing so, you're not only create a cool project for yourself, but you also help the development of this whole space and basically create the world in which you want to live. So that's one thing. And the other thing is, I personally believe that always just strong vision and a mission prevails. So it's like kind of this David versus Goliath myth. I think you also know that David in the end won because he is smart, and because the big giant Goliath, everybody was afraid for him, but in the end it was just not such a smart fellow. But that's kind of how I see it. I hope this provided an answer to your question. Probably not.
To add to that, if you given the talk by Elad Verben here before, you see that from the point of view of him as a co-founder of Lunar Ventures, and also from the point of view of Melanie Rebeck with her nonprofit ventures initiative from the talk yesterday, I do believe we are on the brink of the societal, let's say, paradigm shift from where the powers that, finance move towards that the shift may already be in motion. So by choosing for a structure in both software terms, but also let's say governance-wise, I think you might already be ahead of the curve by choosing for this path. The way Rinke describes it.
I hope so. And, it's really a paradigm shift. And the funny thing is that if you are inside the paradigm, you will not be able to imagine how it is outside of the paradigm. And that's, I would say, the definition of a paradigm shift is that suddenly people realize, oh, we can do things differently. What I personally feel, and I'm actually thinking about this a lot lately, it's just the definition of money. And money having such a very dominant force in our society nowadays. Like if you think about it, is what drives everything. It basically what causes a lot of things, good and bad, in our society. And I think that money is just another thing compared to a business model. It has a lot of connotations, and when money is involved, many things change. But really, like, do we need it in the current form? I definitely think in the current form, not, right? Money is completely whacked out of the context with all the quantitative finance easing and stuff. But it's interesting. And I also think that we are, we need a paradigm shift. And I hope that we are at the brink of a paradigm shift. And how this other world will look, I don't know. But yeah.
A question from Gregor. Yes, and what could you describe the paradigm shift from moving away towards aligned incentives?
Well, maybe Gregor, if you ask the question, do you have some ideas yourself?
He means moving away from the zero-sum game comparison towards collaborative games.
Yeah, of course. I think a zero-sum game, it's inherent in this idea of it's basically what I spoke about, right? So a zero-sum game, I mean, it's not really what's there in the current paradigm, but normally I feel that the paradigm is okay. Is if I have money or invest money, I will get more money, and then the zero-sum game is if I get more money, then you don't get it. I don't think that's really the case, because actually the current paradigm is if we all care more enough about ourselves, then in the end, the whole greater good for the society will be achieved. And that's basically Adam Smith, right, who said that. And I think that's very, very strong, story that is in our current society. Yeah, collaboration. So I think that indeed collaboration is extremely important, and that collaboration, it's made possible by things like collaboration on a much bigger scale, right? Because that's basically what we're talking about. Not just talking about collaboration between you and me, Robert, but we're talking about collaboration of whole nations. And I think that this collaboration, it's possible. Like, we have so much power with our computers and with the technology. It's just that in the current way of doing, maybe it's just not efficient enough. Or it's not credible enough. But if we have smart contracts and if we have technology and we put it in a wise way, I think it could be.
Would it help if there would be trustless collaboration? Petra asks.
No, I think there's always trust involved. But I think it's really important that the channels on which this collaboration is being built are trustless. So that basically means that, let's say, a nation state decides tomorrow to start collaborating on Facebook, right? I'm just saying something like Netherlands decides, let's forget all our normal infrastructure and let's just do everything on Facebook. Like, if the Netherlands starts doing that for 10 years, eventually Facebook will realize, Netherlands, they do everything on our platform, and let's maybe try to influence it a bit here and there, right? And I think that is something that will always happen whenever you build something that is so powerful as collaboration, and you build it on a platform that is owned by somebody or some entity. This entity will try to gain influence on that one way or another. So that's more how I would like to look at trustless in this context. I think that's the kind of the base layer on which we build stuff should be trustless, which is why we have blockchains, why we have Swarm. Because on top of a blockchain, we can create this collaboration, but on top of a centralized system that enforces smart contracts, I don't think we can do it, because sooner or later, this centralized entity will realize the power it has and start abusing it.
Thank you. Yeah. I see there are no further questions. I'd like to thank you for the presentation and the workshop. And
thanks for the interesting questions. I think the question part was good. Yeah.